Thanks. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Can you all hear me all right? Good. Okay, so concept 8. I'm going to read the World Service long form. Um, Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to read the Great Britain long form because this is one where Great Britain differs from America, and I'm much more familiar with the British structure than the American structure. The trustees of the General Service Board act in two primary capacities: A, with respect to the larger matters of overall policy and finance, they're the principal planners and administrators. They directly manage these affairs. But with respect to the executive services provided by the General Service Office, the relation of the trustees is mainly that of custodial oversight, which they exercise through their ability to appoint staff who are charged with carrying out their policies. Right, so this is, I'm afraid, a bit of a messy concept. It's not an easy one either. Part of the story about why we have the structure we have is why we rejected all sorts of other options, and Bill W.'s essay goes into these other rejected options in some detail. A bit of a spoiler, the Great Britain structure actually reflects some of what Bill W. overtly rejects in his essay. So we've got yet it does work, maybe not as well as it might otherwise do. But we can't forget that AA is much bigger in North America than it is in Great Britain. Firstly, because the aggregate population is 5 or 6 times higher. And secondly, well, we're just different here. We don't like groups, we don't like spirituality, we don't like religion, we don't like optimism, we don't like solutions or recovery or any of those things. It's a miracle there's anything going on here in AA at all. But anyway, that's a bit of an opinion there, isn't it? We're not supposed to have those, really, are we? But there we go. Occasionally one sneaks under the radar, doesn't it? So, let's recap where we are with this. So, the General Service Conference, which reflects the fellowship, it's in charge of, now this is a nasty phrase, final decisions on larger matters of general policy and finance. So let's call those the big decisions. But conference can't actually put those into practice because it doesn't have an office. It's there for a couple of days a year. You sit there eating cake and making decisions, and then that's the end of it. So it needs someone to implement these decisions. Enter stage left, the General Service Board. And they get to do a couple of things. They get to plan and they get to administrate. And they do this in essentially in 3 ways. Sometimes, if you watch a board trustee very carefully, he or she does something himself or herself. They take action themselves. Secondly, they chair, in Great Britain, they chair committees, and those committees do things. Some of those committees are made up solely of trustees. Others are simply chaired by a trustee, and they're made up of members of the fellowship. So we've got 2 types of committee. The board's own committees, and then its little subcommittees generally for the service disciplines like health liaison and prisons and public information and so on, young persons AA. So the board does things itself, it has these committees, and then, according to Bill's essay, it has corporations. And rather than running these corporations directly, it appoints a director, the director runs it, and they watch over the director's shoulder. continually, but not continuously. So they let them get on with their job, but they keep an eye. So there are three ways. They do things themselves. They have committees, which they chair, and then they exercise this oversight of the corporations. So in the same way that the conference isn't resourced to do anything more than make big decisions, the board as well, mostly volunteers, well, all volunteers really, some AA, some non-AA, they've all got day jobs or they're retired and live in wherever, but they're not full-time employees, they're not paid, they're volunteers. So there's a limit to what they can do as well. So their scope of their activity is restricted, and it's restricted to 5 things. The questions which Bill calls both large and serious, these large and serious questions. So the large and serious questions are policy, finance, group relations, personal relations, public relations, and leadership. So let's cover those. So policy and finance, we've already got those words mentioned in the conference's decisions. So if the conference makes decisions on policy and finance, then those are matters of concern for the board as well. The next two, group relations, so that's internal relationships within AA, between entities within AA, and then public relations, the relationship with the outside world. Now, these first 4 of the 5, policy, finance, group relations, and public relations, it's not really a list of 4. If you imagine a grid with policy and finance across the top and group relations and public relations on the side, you end up with 4 squares, 2 by 2. And so you've got really policy and finance apply to group relations and policy and finance apply to public relations. There isn't anything else really. There's what's inside AA and there's what's outside AA. Inside and outside, policy and finance in relation to. And the 5th one is the general manner in which the board engages with policy, with finance, with group relations, with public relations. And that's the virtue, and it is a virtue, of leadership. I'm going to say a terrible thing. I was at a meeting a few months ago where someone said, I've mentioned this before, someone said very boldly, there are no leaders in AA. Yes, there are. If you read the concepts, there are. They're not leaders in the ordinary sense of the word. It's defined very carefully what a leader is, but we'll come to that. So basically, the board is concerned with policy and finance in relation to internal matters, external matters, and it does so as a bunch of leaders. So those are your 5 questions. So the reason why they have to delegate an awful lot, as I say, is because they're there much more frequently than the conference, but they're not there constantly. There is a huge amount of work to do, and so there's a division of labour. The board concerns itself with those 5 matters, and then the implementation takes place in as far as they don't do it themselves through the subcommittees, through the corporations. And it talks about the essay talks about the board's action being governed by 3 general principles. And I think these are very good principles: care, deliberation, and skill, which means, I think, care is attention to detail. Deliberation is responding, not reacting. So thinking about things very carefully rather than shooting from the hip or indeed from any other articulation of the body. And then skill. You've got to be, if you don't know how to do it, learn how to do it. One of my bugbears in AA is when people resist the technological changes by saying, I'm not very technological, as though it's some sort of inherent genetic feature. programmed from 50,000 years ago. That there was some genetic quirk which said, well, in 50,000 years' time, when technology comes along, I'm afraid, Susan, you're not going to be very technological. So you're just going to have to play that card whenever someone puts a computer in your face. Uh, I don't like technology. I have to say, uh, it I find it addictive and I find it infuriating, and I don't like things being in charge of me. And you can't argue with technology, but you learn the skills you need to learn. I mean, I don't like people, but I've had to learn. I've had to learn to like people in AA, and I do. I'm being unfair on myself. I do like people a lot more than I used to. But I'm afraid you have to acquire the skills which are required to get the job done. And that's there in the concept: care, deliberation, and skill. And the three stages of the board's work are there's planning, there's execution, that's doing it, and then there's managing it. And managing it could be described as you've got to keep an eye on things, you've got to track the results, you've got to adjust the course, you've got to feedback at the end. Now, the board does the planning, the board does the management, the execution is done largely by other people. So it's in charge of the overall process, and it's that middle one, the execution, that's largely what is delegated. Um, Now, these corporations, this is the sort of theoretical structure. I'm not going to give a lecture on exactly how AA is structured in America right now. You'll have to get, well, let's not name names. There are people you can get to talk about that. So I'm not going to talk about something I don't have personal experience of in terms of American AA. But then the idea is each corporation is, as it were, pretty self-sufficient. It's got its own charter, so it functions in accordance with its internal guidelines. It's got its own working capital. Uh, it's got its own executive level. It's got its own staff level. It's got its own offices. It's got its own employees. And now the relationship between the board and its corporations. So I think I've mentioned this before. In a lot of European legal jurisdictions, if you have a company, it's going to have two boards of directors. Your standard UK private limited company just has a board of directors and that's it. But in the European system, you'll typically have two levels. There's some places have three potentially, but I won't go into that. You've got the executive level, and then you've got this, sometimes it's called an administrative board, sometimes it's called a supervisory board, but they keep an eye on the executive board. They're one stage removed. They're only concerned with very large matters. And so basically, your directors of the corporation, they run it. They really are in charge of it. But there's an extra layer of oversight to make sure they're keeping within the bounds. The bounds of what? The policy and finance decisions made by conference. So the role of the board is to make sure that the corporations stick to what conference wants the corporation to do. The This is likened by Bill to the more the Anglo-Saxon structure of a holding company. So an operating company, a trading company, and above that you have a holding company. So let me just have a look at my notes here. So now this structure, the reason this structure was chosen, I don't want to go into too much detail about the alternatives because they're very involved. They take a very long time to explain in full. But one of the alternatives, rather than having a director of the company, is the board has its own subcommittees. Let's say one for finance, one for public policy. And let's say you're the General Service Office, you're incorporated as a company, but you don't have your own directors. You've got the finance committee telling you one thing on one side, the public information committee telling you something on another side, the public relations committee telling you something on a third side, and with trustees mixing and matching between these different committees, you've got authority coming from all sorts of different angles, and the buck isn't stopping with you because you're having to just kowtow to what these committees are saying. And so this solution, this structure we have in place is a solution to that. You've got the directorship headed up in a single board of the corporation, and then that is accountable directly to the General Service Board. So you don't have multiple lines of authority, and it's very clear what each layer is doing. So you've got authority and responsibility going together. And the only thing that the board has is custodial oversight. So the relationship between conference and the board is basically the same as the relationship between the board and the corporations. So it's just replicating the structure as you go down. One of the alternatives that you might have is, let's say you had rather than having a board and corporations, you just had one big happy family, all mucking in together. The trouble is that family would have no head of the family because the chairman of the board is a volunteer. If ever you've encountered a company where the chief executive officer is mostly on holiday, you'll discover what chaos that brings. So this is why you need the operation separately incorporated, because it needs someone who's like there the whole time running it. And the chairman of the board can't do that. So that's why you can't have everything bundled up under the direct management of the board. And also, you can't have just a manager running all of this stuff. You've got to have someone who's a full director with real legal responsibility. Otherwise, again, you've really got the same problem of the people with the authority of the trustees who are there once every 2 months, and you can't get them in between. But you as the manager are left holding the baby. So this is why so much power and responsibility has to be delegated to the directors of these corporations. Now, the structure in Great Britain is actually a mixture of these. Basically, there is as far as I know, there is a single corporation rather than multiple corporations, and the board manages that corporation through a manager. But that manager is given a huge amount of power. He's given basically the power, or it has been a she in the past, is given the power effectively of a director. I don't think the general manager is a director is a trustee. But in practical terms, there's lots of power there. Let me just have a look at my notes. So the Great Britain structure, just for reference, and in case anyone is listening on the tapes and they're from the UK. So you'll have to get someone else to talk about the precise contemporary American structures. It's an academic talk. It's just from my experience and observation. And I know a little bit about the UK. So what you've got in the UK, in Great Britain rather, because Northern Ireland is part of the Republic of Ireland as far as AA is concerned, the board is formed as its own limited charitable company, and the fellowship has it's just like in the concept, so it matches the concepts pretty much. The fellowship has no actual power over the board. It's not allowed to have power over the board under UK charities legislation, and the Charities Commission are fine with the existence of this strange thing called the fellowship, as long as the groups, the intergroups, and the regions don't incorporate themselves in some way. So they've got to remain informal. And the board in Great Britain, rather than having a director, as I say, directly manages the service office, printing and publication, distribution of books, internal matters, so conferences and convention arrangements, and external communications. But its delegation is mostly through the subcommittees with lots and lots of AA volunteers, and then through the general manager of the General Service Office, who's a paid employee. So as I say, it's a hybrid system. It's not quite as it's not the incorporated system you have in America with two layers. It's a single layer which has its own offices. But what they've done is they've replicated the principle of Concept 8 in how they do that, rather than having these separate corporations. And its committees, it has two types of committees. It has its own committees. This is the board. It's got a finance committee, an executive committee, an internal communications, and then an external communications. And you or I can't get onto those. That's just for board members. Whereas you have these other subcommittees, which are mostly for service. So I was on the Armed Services subcommittee for a few years, and there was one board member and 6 or 7 just members of the fellowship who do all the work. And there, the board member was not an expert in armed services, not necessarily an expert in armed services. One over the years did have some experience. And he just let us do what we needed to do, except if we were about to breach the concepts or the traditions, or to do anything which would cause public difficulties. So I saw Concept 8, this notion of custodial oversight, I saw that working very well in practice. The board member, well, actually there were 3 over time, the board members totally trusted our judgment as to how to manage public relations in terms of armed services liaison and some internal stuff, and simply made sure that we kept within bounds and didn't do anything which would attract the negative attention of the rest of the board. So the material on Concept 8 is a bit of it's difficult to get your head around. There's a lot in there, but actually the principle is very simple. The board can't do everything itself. It has to delegate a whole lot, but it doesn't delegate it and then wipe its hands. It delegates and then manages the process and exercises custodial oversight. Where I think Concept 8 becomes interesting to me, whether it's interesting to you remains to be seen. But where it becomes interesting to me is how I apply it in my own life. So I mentioned a lot of this before, but each concept comes at the same set of ideas it's the same structure from a different angle, and each part of the structure looks different from that different angle. So on one level, and this is a bit of a recap of the earlier concepts, on one level, I'm simply a member of the worldwide fellowship. One person, one vote. I'm dissolved into that whole. Just like at a meeting, when you've got a particularly amusing speaker and everyone's laughing and you forget yourself. Whatever was going on today, you're completely lost in that meeting, and it's wonderful. Unless it's one of those meetings with a dress code, you can't relax at those. If you have a nap in the meeting, you have to have a nap with one eye open. But I'm talking about ordinary meetings where, without all the rules and regulations and without all the old timers sitting, by the doors and round the edge just to keep an eye on everyone. So you dissolve into the whole. And that's who I really am. I'm part of this greater consciousness. However, as a friend of mine says, I don't know why I am on the material plane, but the data in so far suggests that I am on the material plane. So let's act like I've got a job to do here. It's no good me sitting there 24 hours a day dissolved into the whole of the fellowship and just sort of floating through. I've got a job to do. And now how does that job get done? I like to make a distinction between, and this is my own distinction. It's an eccentric one, I'll admit, but it works for me. A distinction between my, as it were, spirit mind and my physical mind. And my spirit mind, this is concepts 2 and 6, when I have to make a final decision on a large matter of general policy and finance. When I'm pulling the big levers in my life, there might be a bit of technical working out of what the options are, what the permutations are, what the pros are, what the cons are, all of that. But ultimately, those decisions get made at a gut level. When someone, when someone asks you to marry them, for instance, you don't sit there with a piece of foolscap paper and doing flow charts. Either you say yes or you don't, or maybe you use flow charts. I don't. On those many occasions I've been asked to marry someone. But you get the point. You get the point. It's never happened. I asked the question. But you make that decision. There's not a calculation. It's made at a different level. And all the final decisions on large matters, I find, are made at a high level. And if I'm in contact with my spirit, they tend to get made pretty well. And sometimes the decision there goes against all logic and reason, or all surface logic and reason. That's why I think it's always a red flag when I hear someone talking about relationships and dating someone and they say he or she ticks all the boxes. Like, that's not the level these decisions get made. You're not buying wood to build a shed in your garden. There you want to tick certain boxes. That's a different matter. But that's actually, let's use that as the example. So my spirit mind makes the decision about whether I want a shed in the garden. The physical mind does all the calculations about exactly what wood is going to be suitable. They're different. They're fundamentally different types of decision. So that higher level of decision making, I'm tapping into the universal consciousness and drawing something down from it. And to do that, this is step 11. This is tradition 2. I've got to be at peace. I've got to be at rest. It says we've entered the world of the spirit on page 84. So those big decisions, I've got to be connected with spirit. Once that decision is made, it's as though it gets passed down to the physical brain for implementation. And what concept 8 tells me is that we've got 3 types of activity once the decision comes down from my spirit mind to my physical brain. Planning, pretty straightforward. Execution, which means do it or delegate it. And if concept 8 had a slogan, that's what the slogan I think would be. Do it or delegate it. And then management. You monitor what's going on, you track the results, you adjust the course, and you feedback. And all of that is technical thinking. Now, that lower technical thinking, I think we've got to have a hotline to God at all times. But when I'm depressed, or when I'm agitated, or when I'm this, or when I'm that, I can still fry an egg. I can still wire a plug. I can still do all of the things which are required. I'm a translator. I can still translate. If there's emotional radio interference, that does make it harder, but basically I can still do it. But if I'm in that state, I cannot make big decisions. And that's the fundamental difference between the 2 levels of the spirit mind and the physical mind. And with the physical mind, very few decisions are deliberate and conscious. The thousands of operations involved in writing a letter, for instance, are largely automatic. And if I get stuck, I look at concept three, I can ask for help or I can consult someone. But basically, nearly everything is automatic at that level. Um, and there's an interesting line in A Course in Miracles. I haven't fully integrated this idea, but I think it's connected. Um, where the voice of God, or it's actually technically the voice of Jesus in A Course in Miracles, says to you, the reader, if you place yourself in my hands, this is a paraphrase, if you place yourself in my hands, I will guide everything that matters and take care of everything that doesn't. What's the stuff that doesn't matter? Well, at the practical level. So all that practical stuff becomes automatic when you place yourself in the hands of the higher power. And then the guidance comes with the bigger decisions. And I think that's largely how things work. I get guidance from God on big things, and then in a practical sense, pretty much everything is automatically trained over time. It's technical training. These two levels of execution, so I can do something myself or I can delegate the job. That delegation can be internally within the family, within friends, within the AA group. It can be externally to contractors or professionals. I grew up with the notion that you have to do everything yourself, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you. So it was always seen, if you hired someone to do something, it was a sign of failure and inadequacy. So a real person, a real man, a real woman, a real whatever, does everything themselves. I don't know where this idea came from, but it's crap. Um, I found sanity in delegating as much as possible so that I'm left with what really matters. And what really matters, it's those 5 areas we talked about earlier: policy, finance, internal relations, external relations, and leadership. So policy and finance, what am I going to do with my life? Where am I going to get the resources to do it? Policy and finance, knowledge of God's will for me and the power to carry that out. Internal relations, so that's my internal condition. My external relations, my relationships with other people, and then leadership, which we'll talk about next week. Now, the reason I mention all of this is because I get very, I walk rather a tightrope between two types of psychological problem. I get very, very wrapped up in, on one hand, in detail. If I'm at work for, 8, 10 hours a day, do you ever find that when you finish work, your body has finished work, but your mind is still thinking about it 10 minutes later, half an hour later, an hour and a half later? I live pretty much on the edge of the city of London, which is the financial district. And sometimes I mean, there's no one around at the moment, but under ordinary circumstances, I would go for a walk in the early evening. And the number of people you see walking down the street, glassy-eyed, literally still having a conversation with someone in the office, and the lips are moving. There's no one there, but the lips are moving. The later you walk, the higher the proportion of the people who are walking along with their lips moving, because they've been at it for longer, so they're finding it harder to come out of it. So I get very wrapped up in small details. And there is a small animal in my mind, which basically spends all day going, what's wrong? There's something wrong. We've got to find something wrong. Is there something wrong? What's that sound? Does that sound mean there's something wrong with the gas central heating system? What's wrong? What was that in the street? What was that? It's always looking for things which are wrong. Obsessed with minor details of life. It's the princess and the pea thing. I don't know if you're familiar with, I don't know how culturally widespread the story of the princess and the pea is. So the princess can't sleep because there is a pea under her mattress. Presumably, uh, when in the story it says pea, it means rather than a sort of peas in a pod, which are rather squishy when they're cooked. I mean, a pea. It must be those sort of hard dried peas. I presume that's what they're talking about there. Um, but she can't sleep because there is a pea under the mattress. And so she puts mattress upon mattress upon mattress, but she can still feel the pee because she's so obsessed with these. If there's one thing wrong, everything's messed up. So I get very distracted by lots and lots of practical details, and it can totally fill my consciousness. So there is no time for bigger questions. There's no time to look at my genuine internal state. There's no time to look at my relationships with other people because I'm obsessed with 47 minor details, each of which is irritating me because the details won't go how I need them to go. Okay, so that's problem number one. So you'd say, well, just operate at a higher level, detach from the material. And then, well, that's fine. But then it's like those, I've got a memory. I think I was pretty traumatized by this. When I was like 9, I grew up in the country. We would go on these field trips, and these field trips were basically how many can we kill before sundown? And one of these field trips it involved this walk along the top of a ridge with like these drops down either side, and they kept having to do head counts to make sure we hadn't lost one to the left or lost one to the right. So anyway, fine. I mustn't get distracted by all of the practical stuff. You've got to deal with it, but don't get distracted by it. Operate at a much higher level. But you see, it's like that ridge. There's a drop on both sides, and the drop on the other side is so fine. I abstract from the detail, I go to a higher level, and I start asking questions like, what's the point in my life? What's the point in any life? Why is the planet here? If my job is just to help other people, well, what's the point in that? Because if their job is to help still other people, who's actually getting helped? No one is getting helped. We're all just helping each other to get out of our own minds, but there's no point in anyone's life. At this point, it's now 7 minutes past 5 in the morning, and it's, 53 minutes before I can legitimately get up. And so I get lost in theological and ontological and eschatological and other logical, uh, uh, epistemological and deontological abstractions, all of the ologies. And sometimes I get so distracted I physically can't move because there's a Woody Allen film, I can never remember which one, where there's this kid and he won't do his homework because he's discovered that the universe is endlessly expanding and eventually will expand and expand and expand, and everything will cool down bit by bit, and all matter will gradually get further and farther apart from all other matter until all matter is distributed infinitely throughout space at a temperature of absolute zero. So given that that is where the universe is going, why do my homework? And the kid is 7. Now, it's cute when the kid is 7. When you're 47, it's not so cute anymore when there's stuff that needs to get done and you're lost. So what has this got to do with concept 8? Well, I'm going to tell you. So, concept 8 is about operating at the correct level, not operating above your pay grade, but not operating below your pay grade. Now, in any given day, I need to spend a tiny little bit of time at the level of spirit mind, making large decisions, final decisions on large matters of policy and finance. I need to spend longer on the plan and the manage aspects of the implementation of those decisions. So I'm planning and managing the various aspects of my life and the various roles and all of that. But I need to spend most of my time just practically getting on with the tasks at hand, not fussing about them. And I think this is the trick. There is a story about a monk and some trainee monks, and he sends the 3 trainee monks off on a bicycle ride. And they come back, and he says to them, "So, what did you do on your bicycle ride?" And the first one says, "Well, I was considering the nature of the Trinity." That's what he was doing on his bicycle ride. The second one, well, I was reciting my French irregular verbs, and the monk said, "Well, both of these are very good activities. Well done." And the third one said rather sheepishly, "Well, I was just riding my bike." And the monk said, "You win." When you're riding a bike, that's what you're supposed to be doing, is riding a bike. My ego doesn't like the fact that most of the day I'm supposed to be just riding the bike. I'm supposed to be just doing the thing which is in front of me to the best of my ability. And as I say, the fretting about details as opposed to just dealing with them. Fretting about details is operating at the wrong level. That's spending too much time at the plan and manage level, and then getting too lost in major decisions of, I can never remember the phrase. What is it? Final decisions on large matters of general policy and finance. That's getting way above my pay grade. So this is about, in each given part of the day, where am I residing? Am I residing at the operational level? Or am I residing at the board level, doing some planning and some managing? Or am I residing at the conference level, where I'm engaged in these major decision-making activities? Or am I completely lost, dissolved into the world? And that can happen when you go for a walk, when you're at a meeting, when you're having dinner with friends, when you're playing the piano, whatever it is. And when I'm well, I'm spending the right amount of time in each of those 4 layers: the operational, the board level, the conference level, the fellowship level. When I'm out of whack, I'm invariably spending too much time in one and not enough time in another. If you never make large decisions about policy and finance, your life will gradually go off track and you'll wonder what happened for the last 20 years. Or whatever. And I have a habit of avoiding large decisions. If I spend too much time in the planning and managing and not the executing, that's my fretting about the material world. If I don't spend enough time at the fellowship level, I end up feeling separate. So I've got to get those 4 levels in balance, and understanding that those are like different modes of being in the universe, and I need to spend time in each one, and knowing which one. And a good example of where this goes wrong. So planning and managing once a day, I've got all of my roles in life. I review the roles once a week, approximately, and say, right, what are the projects, what are the tasks? And then once a day, all those tasks are in different folders according to whether the ball is in my court, the ball is in someone else's court. It's the job for today, it's the job for tomorrow, it's the job for the day after. And I review, where are we with everything? What's the status? It takes about 5-10 minutes to run through everything. I rejig things, I send out reminders, I work out what's going to get done today, and I put it away and trust the system. There's nothing worse than when you're trying to work, or you're trying to go for a walk, or you're trying to play with the cat, or you're trying to do whatever it is, and you're fussing and fretting. You're not actually doing anything to plan and manage your life. You're just fussing about it. Similarly, with the major decisions, like I've had one recently. Are we going to renovate and refurbish one of the rooms in the flat? Rather than sitting down and actually planning it, I've just been fussing about it in my mind. Nothing is achieved by it. If I want, and the advice that was given to me a long time ago, and I wish I followed it more often, was if you're going to make a major decision in your life, fine, but set aside some deliberate time to think about it. Start time, stop time, structure it, write things down, look at pros and cons. So you dedicate some time to it, but you don't live there. Um, I don't know how many of you sponsor, but if you sponsor, you're going to have about 1 in 5 sponsees that phones up about 4 times a week saying, I've just had a massive realization. I know what needs to change in my life. And they need to change their home group. They need to go and live in Barbados. Um, they need a new sponsor. They need to change they need new hair. They need to change this. They need to change. And if you added up all of these major decisions which are made, there will be 500 to 600 major decisions made a year, each at the level of the whole. This is spending too much time at conference. Note that um, conference meets once a year. The board meets 6 times a year. The directors and their staffs are there doing their jobs every day. And the director is only a fraction of the operation. Most of the operation is the operatives. And the big block to me doing this, there are a couple of big blocks. The first one, you see, most of my time should be spent doing the tasks of the day. And Brother Lawrence is very good at this, practicing the presence of God by Brother Lawrence. Talking about doing everything for the sake of God rather than for, ulterior motives, but treating everything as the service of God. And that's the real ideal. But as I say, I've got blocks to doing that. The first one is this imagined self-importance. Well, if all I'm doing is just menial tasks, what's the point? Who am I then? So ego gets in the way. And the second thing that gets in the way is if I don't worry, who will? Like worry is some kind of cosmic obligation which keeps the planet spinning on its axis. And if I stop worrying, things will really get look at how this is the worry voice. Look at how things are now. Just look. If I stop worrying, just imagine how much worse they're going to get. That's literally the way my mind is built logically. A friend, I've mentioned this before, I'm sure, but when the plane is taking off, you can't read your book because you're listening to the engines, just to make sure the engines are making the noise you think they're supposed to make. You know nothing about aviation, you know nothing about airplanes, but you still figure that if you listen carefully to the sound of the engines, you'll get enough advance notice that something is going wrong for you to do something about it. And when you finally reach a cruising height, now you can read your book. You look around you see other people doing it. And you notice some people like totally fine and others like tensely not turning a page for 10 minutes. So this is very simple. Conference meets once a year. I engage in major decisions of policy and finance infrequently. The board meets regularly. I plan and manage only as far as necessary. I don't live there. I want to live in the operational side of things, and I want to live, forgetting myself completely, just dissolved into the fellowship as a whole. There are some other little points here. There are some principles of concept 8 which I find very helpful to enact what I've just been talking about, probably at excessive length. I need to trust. I need to trust humanity. Now, It's a bit of a tall order, but what else are you going to do? Because worrying about them doesn't make them more trustworthy. So you just have to trust if you're going to get through the day, I've found. Um, it talks in the concept essay about the excessive concentration of money and power. And I think this is enormously helpful. Um, it talks about the board being free to concentrate on what is important. And I found when I've had an excessive concentration of money or power in my life, that weighs me down. It attaches me to the material world more than is healthy for me. I don't know about anyone else. So I follow the Dennis F principle of uh, I've got to be prudent about my finances, but not accumulating money for its own sake, not looking for power for its own sake. If I'm given power in some domain, parachute myself in, do what needs to be done, get out again, but not to be attached to any of that stuff. It also talks in the um, concept essay about conflicting interests, and I'm very careful to keep things that should be kept separate. So I don't hire other people do different things. It's fine. I don't hire AAs to do a job. If I need someone to do a job, I get a non-AA to do it because I don't want the two areas to affect each other. As my first sponsor said, I think maybe I had a crush on someone in AA, or maybe we're just talking about it generally. And my sponsor said, don't shit where you eat, princess. So if you're gonna date someone, if you're gonna do whatever, find one of the 7 billion people who aren't in AA. I mean, there are enough to choose from. Um, I don't know if I've mentioned this before. This is controversial. Don't make friends with sponsees. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have a friendly relationship with sponsees. You have often a very close relationship, and it can look very much like friendship, but it's not the same. It's whenever I've succeeded in it once in 27 years of having a sponsee where they became a friend and it worked. Every single other situation, it's produced complications. So there is an invisible line there. There's an invisible line between me and my sponsor. We are very much like friends, but there is a line. Because it must be possible to, it talks in the concept about jettisoning something that goes wrong without it having a knock-on effect. It's like bulkheads in a ship. So if one of the compartments gets breached, it doesn't sink the whole ship because there are bulkheads stopping each of those. Or in Star Trek, there are Star Trek equivalents. If there is a breach on deck 7, it won't affect decks 8 and 9. Um, and this is what I'm going to say now is controversial as well. Um, I think there are different callings in AA. Some people appear to come into AA to get their lives sorted out, but then they're back out again, and they don't drink, and they come to AA. Maybe they go to a couple of meetings a week. They will do a tiny little bit of. They might be the treasurer at a group. They'll sponsor a couple of people, but basically they're living fully in the material world, and the the fellowship is there as a support and an insurance policy. There are some of us, for whatever reason, there are theories about this, which I haven't got time to go into. The circuits are burned out, and we can't uh, have a fully ordinary life. Don Pritz talks about this. surprisingly, because he's a very practical person. One of the things he would say is, uh, a 9 to 5 existence will not be enough. You need something more than that. And this is the theme which runs through the big book as well, particularly the chapter 11, A Vision for You. Now, there's nothing wrong with one approach or the other, but it is my belief that you've got to know which type you are. There's no good being someone that basically their job is to be, God's job for them is to be completely involved in the material world, and they dip into the world of the spirit, they dip into the world of recovery for a bit of help. That's not a superior thing, it's not an inferior thing. But if you're like that and you're trying to be something else, it's not going to work. Similarly, when I've tried to go too deep into the material world, put down roots too deeply, I get poisoned very quickly. So I know what type of person I am now. I've got to be someone that operates chiefly in the realm of the spirit. Uh, I mean, I have a career. I've 2 careers, in fact. Um, I look after practical stuff very effectively, but it's not who I am. It's not where I live. And so I think one's got to find one's space, and where this becomes super relevant. You make a mistake with yourself, fine, you can recover from that pretty easily. But the problem comes with sponsoring other people. You can only pass on what you do yourself. When I found sponsorship fail, I think it's usually because I've got someone that's destined for a different type of life in sobriety. And what I'm trying to pass on to them is suitable for like the full octane steps, traditions, concepts, firing on all pistons in service is just not right for everyone in AA. It's almost heretical to say this, but when someone is resisting, it's not that sometimes they're just not willing, fine. But sometimes they just need a different approach to AA, a different approach to recovery. And the reason that's come in with concept 8 is it's this avoiding the accumulation of excessive funds and power is about detachment from the physical world, detachment from the material world, even though you're still involved in the detachment from it. So that's how it hooks in. And just the last thing, that yes, the 3 qualities of the board to apply in my own life. So care, looking after the detail, doing everything to the best of my ability, even if no one's watching. Secondly, respond, don't react. I can't tell you how many times I rack my brains about how to respond to someone. And if I let it go and leave it for a day, I come back and I know exactly what to say, and it turns out to be the right thing. And skills, acquiring the requisite skills to do the jobs both in AA and outside AA. I'm just looking at, are there any questions? There are no questions. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening yet again.